Hey everyone, good afternoon. We're in the final stretch, but we have another awesome presentation to kick off. And then stay tuned right afterwards. After he's done with questions, I'm going to go ahead and give you some info about going to the party tonight. But without further ado, let me introduce Nathaniel Strauss from Shakopee Public Schools. Going to talk all about using NoMAD Login with Jamf Pro. And so turn it over to you, Nathaniel.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks for coming, everybody. I am Nathaniel Strauss from Shakopee Public Schools. We have about 4,500 Macs, and being a school district, every year, we pretty much have to refresh those Macs. So that means, basically, we deploy 700 to 750 Macs per year. So, there we go. Okay, perfect. And so that's pretty much a yearly refresh cycle that we have to deal with. It was passed on by our school board at some point that instead of rolling out these Macs year by year, maybe 9th grade through 12th grade, because we are a 1-through-1 program, that instead we just deploy everything at the same time, all 4 grades at the same time. So instead of doing 1 year's worth of work, that ended up being 4 years worth of work. So before we get any further, let's look at the agenda, talk about how we got here, what NoMAD Login actually is, the security authorization database and auth changer, deploying NoMAD Login with Jamf and DEP, and then how to integrate NoMAD Login with NoMAD. So I just wanted to go over account types on a Mac, just regular account types, because I realize not everybody understands what all the common ones are. So we're going to talk about how to get to local accounts today. So a local account uses the local directory service, and you authenticate locally on a computer. The account info is local, and there's no LDAP binding required. A mobile account is probably what most people are used to. It's probably what a lot of people are still using. You're bound to the Mac. The authentication authority is still LDAP, a lot of the time Active Directory. Your account info is cached locally on that computer, and again, you are bound. The network account is probably used less often, maybe used more in a lab environment than anything else. And this is where you are still authenticating to LDAP, like Active Directory. Your account info is mostly stored on the network, usually on a network drive. And LDAP binding, again, is happening. So why did we decide that a local account was what we wanted to move to? It's really about which authority holds the keys. Right? So when I have a Mac, usually a laptop at this point, I want to make sure that that Mac can always log in and that user never doesn't have a way to log into their Mac. So if I'm using a bound account, a mobile account, and I have to authenticate back to Active Directory, and I can't hit that authentication authority, it should use a cached credential, right? You've all seen this. You're not on site. You don't have a route back to AD. And as a result, it just uses the credential that it can cached. Well, that has a lot of ways of breaking. The AD plugin that's responsible for all the authentication of mobile accounts tends to fail in spectacular ways all the time and is kind of unreliable. With a local account, though, you never have to worry about that. As well, you run into a lot of keychain issues. We work in a school. It's an education environment. And so as a result, people forget their passwords a lot. And so what ends up happening is that we have to change that password off device, usually just through Active Directory or through our web portal. And as a result, when we log in again, the keychain has no record, no knowledge of that password having changed. And either to update that keychain, you need the old password, or you need to create a new keychain. If you're only using a local account to authenticate, that keychain always has a chance to update, and it won't really ever break. That probably brought our support calls down. I don't know, it was a lot. We had a lot of keychain issues. You get those just pop-up windows one after another, and it's just a pain to deal with. So being able to avoid the keychain issues was a big help to us. As well, you don't really have to bind anymore. You don't really need AD mobile accounts anymore, because all the functionality you get from those accounts, you can get through a helper application like NoMAD. So the DEP setup assistant is okay. It has a lot of issues, but one thing that it doesn't do for us is actually authenticate. It only has basic authentication back to your MDM, and so it can't force a username, it can't force a password, it can't guarantee that either of those things will actually match your LDAP or your identity provider. As a result, when you go through Setup Assistant and you create a local account at the Setup Assistant, anybody can set an account username or password to be anything they want. It doesn't have to match your existing infrastructure. And so we have this. You've probably seen this in Setup Assistant. You have a way to authenticate, but at the very next screen, they have a box where they can actually delete the username, delete the password, and they can type in absolutely anything they want to. If you work in an environment that's mostly adults, that's usually not a problem. Adults know how to handle themselves, they're professionals, they know what to do. If you work in an environment that's mostly 9th through 12th graders, they get very creative very quickly. And in a rollout session, we can't babysit every single one and make sure they type in the right thing or follow the directions. And so this is kind of a non-starter for us. We really didn't want kids to have the ability to create their own accounts. And so what we tried to do was automate the creation of local accounts during DEP Setup Assistant. So, and I'm not recommending this, but this is what we did. During DEP authentication, we'd capture that username. That username would then be associated with the Jamf record. We'd have an LDAP EA that would grab their birthday from Active Directory. It was a custom attribute. We'd then use an LDAP EA to bring that into Jamf, then use the Jamf API to bring down their username, their birth date, and then make a default password with that. So the generic password for them would be something like their first initial, last initial, and their birth date in a certain format. And so it kind of worked. It worked pretty well. The main issues are that we had some students that didn't have a birth date field populated. So what would happen is that they get to the login screen and there was nothing to log into because our automated script couldn't create an account with sysadmin CTL without a password. So this is a code example of what I did. And again, we're passing a password on the command line in clear text, so don't do this. This was my workaround in production because I really couldn't do anything else. But you can see I grabbed the UUID with System Profiler, made an API call, grabbed the birth date with XPath, did some text manipulation, and then ran sysadmin CTL to add that user with the default password. So again, this worked pretty well. The real problem was that if it failed, there was no user interaction telling them that it failed. And also, they had to wait at the login screen like maybe 20 seconds before Jamf kicked in, and then that script ran. So enter NoMAD Login. Joel, at some point, visited us in Shakopee. Let's talk about our NoMAD deployment. And at that time, he mentioned to me, I might have some product, some piece of software in the works behind the scenes that might be able to do this for you. And I'm like, oh, OK, that's great. When it gets released, let me know. And so when that first beta dropped, I pretty much immediately started working with it because I really wanted this in our environment. Again, we're an education organization, we're a school district, we have very small staff, and we deploy minimum 700 devices a year, as well as deployments throughout the year. So we need some automated way to do this. We can't be hands-on the entire time. So what is NoMAD Login? It is a login window authorization plugin. So that is something that either extends or replaces, maybe not the best word, but replaces the login window authentication process. So what it does is it creates local accounts based on AD users. It replaces the default login window. It lives in library security agent plugins. I think that's a standard that Apple requires to actually run this. And it's controlled by something called Authorization Mechanisms. So to actually deploy NoMAD Login, it's a pretty easy formula. You need an installer package that has it. You need to change the authorization mechanisms. You need to set the preferences. Then you need to launch NoMAD Login. It's the same for most other applications. The kind of tricky step is that authorization mechanism part. What is that? How does it work? And why does it matter? We'll go over that in a little bit. First thing I want to talk about is the package. So when you're choosing your package, there are two options. There's just NoMAD Login.package, and there's NoMAD Login-AuthChanger.package. Don't be confused. They both contain AuthChanger. Okay? This is kind of trips me up sometimes. All right? And I kind of had to convince people is that both packages have AuthChanger. Okay? You don't need to think about not having that utility, which we'll talk about in a second. The only difference is that the AuthChanger version of that package has a Postinstall script that does all the AuthChanger stuff for you after the install happens. So here's what that package looks like. It is NoMAD Login AD.bundle and AuthChanger. And that AuthChanger utility, that binary, runs and adds the authorization mechanisms that you need to actually make NoMAD Login work. So what are authorization mechanisms? I keep on saying this word, this phrase over and over again. So this is, I don't know if we can agree on a definition, but this is the definition I have. It is a piece of code that performs a step in the authorization process. So if you're not completely familiar with the authorization steps at the login window, Apple has a bunch of mechanisms that run by default at the login window. And that's just part of their process. However, a developer could extend the authorization process with their own mechanisms. And that's essentially what NoMAD Login does. And so all the kind of cool tricks that it can do are based on these authorization mechanisms. So it runs in order at the login window. They're actually sequential. One mechanism defines one function. And in the case of NoMAD Login, all the code for these mechanisms are actually in that bundle that are installed through the package. Two easy ways to view what your current mechanisms are. You can use a security command to actually read the authorization database, or you can use AuthChanger, which is that utility baked into the installation package. Security is great, but AuthChanger does all that work for you without having to mess with anything else. So really, I recommend using AuthChanger when you can. And just to define AuthChanger, it is a utility to read and write authorization mechanisms. Again, it's included in all the packages. Any package that you install, downloaded from, I don't know if Jamf's going to have them hosted now, or if it's going to continue to be on the GitLab project. There is an open source GitLab project that has all this information on it. The link to that will be at the end of the presentation as well. And it's preferred over the security commands. The reason for that is because AuthChanger can do a bunch of things. Like I said, it can read and write mechanisms. Before, what we'd have to do is we had just this like text file of all the mechanisms listed. It's basically an XML file that had them all listed out. And so we would just use that file as a security command to pipe in and out that file. So having a static file that's on disk that you need to reference over and over to modify something that's important to your machine as logging in, probably not something stable. It's actually really fragile. Having AuthChanger, though, those things are hard-coded in. So as long as you have that binary, you can get back to a stable working state. If all you have is that text file and you put it somewhere like I would in the temp folder, which you don't want to do, then you reboot your computer, a temp file is temp for a reason. You know, it will disappear on you. So to see the default mechanisms after you've installed NoMAD Login, all you have to do is run authchanger-print. And right now on your Mac, unless you have NoMAD Login installed, this is what the default mechanisms are. These are the default mechanisms as far back as I've tested, which is Sierra through Mojave. This is what they look like. This is just out of the box when you turn on your Mac for the first time. You'll see things like the policy banner, if you ever have used a policy banner, and then just the regular login process runs from there. Now, if we ran AuthChanger AD, and then AuthChanger print to add those mechanisms in, instead we would see these new mechanisms added. Everything in blue is what NoMAD Login AD adds. And so you can see these are all the cool tricks that NoMAD Login gives us. Check AD. You are checking and authenticating against AD. You can put up another policy banner. You can do things like demobilize your mobile accounts. Okay, so if you have a mobile account that exists and you want to move it to local because you're just sick of AD and you want to dump it as fast as you possibly can, install NoMAD Login, log into that mobile account with a demobilize flag set, and you have a local account now. You don't have to create one fresh. You can convert one that you already have. Enable FDE, so it has support for File Vault. And then at the very bottom, keychain add is a really cool thing that I will show you at the end of this presentation. What that enables us to do is actually create a NoMAD keychain entry. And so when a user logs into NoMAD Login for the first time, they are already logged into NoMAD, and they get their curb ticket, and they are done. They don't have to do anything else. So how do we set these preferences? You can do it with a profile, like almost anything else. But what I've been doing is setting them with default commands. And the reason for this is probably not as good as it used to be since yesterday. So I'm not going to take the blame for not updating my presentation since yesterday's keynote. But essentially, before yesterday, await configuration, which is an MDM function, was not possible. And so what that meant is that there was no guarantee that before NoMAD Login launched at the login window that we had any preferences set. Now we have await configuration, which enables us to actually make sure that the profile, which sets all your preferences, is installed, and then NoMAD Login launches. So the default commands, pretty simple. These are the three most common ones, I think. The first one just sets your AD domain. The second one sets your background image. And the third one sets your logo. There's a whole bunch of other preferences you can set in regular NoMAD product line fashion. There are preferences overflowing abundantly. So there's tons of stuff, and they're all documented on the wiki on the open source project. All right, so we looked at the package. We looked at authorization mechanisms. And we looked at how to set the preferences for this. So what does this all look like in a regular workflow with Jamf, with DEP, with NoMAD Login? So before we move on, I just need to get on my soapbox for a second. Imaging is dead. All right, it's gone. We can grieve it. You know, we cannot accept it. We can put posts on Jamf Nation. We can tweet about it. We can whatever about it. You can have your crazy Mojave workflows that sort of work out of the box sometimes. It's gone. You know, it's not coming back. So, you know, denial springs eternal. Just accept it and move on, okay? So this is what kind of a generic, typical deployment cycle looks like. DEP enrollment happens, and at that point we are skipping account creation because we're passing it off to NoMAD Login. We're using the enrollment complete trigger. The package gets installed. We set the preferences. The authorization mechanisms get set. We kill the login window. All right, that's sort of a weird one. So again, in the past, like with the defaults commands, we had to kill the login window because, again, usually the login window process would start before we had NoMAD Login installed. I haven't tested it out yet, so hopefully it works because I'm saying it right now. That shouldn't be the case anymore. The new await configuration settings in 10.9, I think, should let you essentially say, NoMAD Login is installed, this profile is installed, now we can launch NoMAD Login. So that kill login window step, we're good. All right, getting confirmation. Perfect. All right. Shouldn't have to happen anymore. But in this script that I'm about to show you, it does. All right, so let's take a look at the PreStage enrollment settings for this. You can keep pretty much everything you have now. Just do the same thing you have been doing. The only difference is you need to skip account creation. You are not using Setup Assistant anymore to create accounts. It is not happening. It does not do the things we need it to do. It doesn't let us match our LDAP accounts, our IDP, whatever we're using. Instead, we're passing that creation step, that provisioning step, off to NoMAD Login. So Here's what a typical post-install script looks like. You're setting those 3 preferences from before. You are running AuthChanger. Again, AuthChanger is the utility that sets authorization mechanisms. And it's really important to note that without this step, this just won't work, because at no point has a configuration been set to tell the login window to run NoMAD Login. You're not actually opening an application in the regular sense, and the login window is kind of a weird spot to run software. You know, you're kind of in, you're not in user land at all. You're kind of at the computer level, but it's its own beast. And so the authorization mechanisms are really what makes that thing run. So you'll notice that I'm using the reset and AD flags. What reset does is just make sure you're at a good working state. If you had mucked around with them at all before with a script or with AuthChanger, then this is a way to just a fail-safe to make sure you're back at a good working state. Something else to mention about AuthChanger, it is really useful, but not that smart yet. It only appends. So if you run AuthChanger AD like 5 times, you're going to get 5 sets of authorization mechanisms, and it's not going to go well. It's going to break. So that reset flag is really, really useful, and there's a reason you can run it with the other flags. Next thing I'm doing is killing the login window, which, again, you don't have to do anymore. And that will pop up NoMAD Login. Then you can log in as your user and go from there. So in Jamf, what I typically do is create an enrollment complete policy that installs NoMAD Login and then runs the Postinstall Script, which sets the preferences and sets the authorization mechanisms, and then we'll kill the login window. This might have to change a little bit now that await configuration actually works. The assumption before was that NoMAD Login wouldn't be running because there was no way to make it run. But yeah, we'll see about that. But that's basically it. That's all you really need to do. So I've got a video here to show you to walk through the entire process. Is that running? It is. Oh, okay, good. Thank you. And again, this is the old school style where we don't have a wait configuration yet, so you do have to wait about 20 seconds. So we're logging in as our test user. And this is actually what we do in production. I didn't grab anything. This is just what we do. I will cop to editing it slightly, so it's a little bit faster than it might be in your environment. And that's it. We went through DEP. We enrolled in our Jamf Pro server. We installed the NoMAD Login package, set the preferences, set the auth max, and we're done. We are logged into a local account right now. All right, a few things about that. You have to have a route back to AD. So some people don't let their computers connect back to their internal infrastructure until a certain point. But obviously, to connect to Active Directory, you need to have a route back to Active Directory. So just make sure that you do. Whether that's 802.1x, whether that's whatever you need, just make sure before you actually authenticate the login window, you're doing that. The other part of this is, do I want to keep NoMAD Login after I provision my user? So some people, you can just keep it around forever. Next time you log in, it'll just be a local login like it normally would be. You get a really nice branded login window experience, and it's fine. In our case, we just rip it off, and all you've got to do is reset those auth mechs, because without those mechanisms there, it won't run. That's pretty much it. It's a really easy cleanup for you. I'm considering making it a permanent login window, just because I do kind of like having the logo there. And maybe it can do cool tricks later, like with some scripts that are running or something else. But for now, we're ripping it off afterwards, and people just use the regular stock login window they're used to. So here's the piece I think people are really interested in. NoMAD Login now has the ability to securely pass a user's credentials to a keychain entry, so that user is automatically signed into NoMAD. All right, caveat to this, NoMAD has to be installed before authentication. I usually say before NoMAD Login's installed just to make sure that you have it done there. But what happens is that to create that keychain entry and to create the ACLs you need for that to work, the app has to be referenced, all right? So you can't create a keychain entry that references nothing. It has to reference an existing NoMAD install that's already there. So that requires 2 additional preferences, keychain add NoMAD and keychain create. The first one adds a keychain entry, and the second creates a keychain if it needs to. And this is all you have to do. Just 2 more default commands, or with the new way configuration stuff, it will be in the profile that you have already set up. All right, let's take a look at that in action. So this is just me logging into the NoMAD Login window with my test user. I'm authenticating to AD. It's creating the desktop for the first time. Here's my local account. And in a second, NoMAD will pop up. And there's my green checkbox. I'm logged in. All right? That's all I have to do. I have my curb ticket. I have my keychain entry. The user credentials were already passed. They don't need to ever sign into NoMAD. What's really nice about that is that maybe a user never needs to know what NoMAD even is. I mean, we kind of want them to, but if all you're doing is Kerberos authentication, then at that point you have a curb ticket. And if you renew your curb ticket on a regular basis, you'll always have one. They will always have that curb SSO experience available to them without ever having to actually log into it at all. It happens a lot to us, actually, in that we're like, yeah, log into NoMAD. And they're like, yeah, we don't know what that is. It's like, OK, so click on the triangle in the menu bar, and from there, sign in. That's not too bad, but it usually rolls around during exam time when they need to print, and they can't. Yeah, the reason is because you aren't signed into NoMAD. Well, that pretty much is over. Now that we can auto-sign in, the whole process is pretty seamless. So along with NoMAD, you get all that extra goodness in terms of AD functionality. And that's probably a whole other session on NoMAD itself. But we have this kind of seamless deployment process now where we can log in with NoMAD Login, create a local account, auto-log in to NoMAD, and then we have all the functionality of AD without ever having to actually bind your computer. And the paid versions of this are now Jamf Connect, but open source is still open source, and you can still use it for free. And that is basically it. I have a few resources. I have a bit.ly link in here, my website, and my GitHub. But I will post the slides to this later on. And if you have any questions, you know, I'm really pretty active on the Mac admin Slack, and so come join us in NoMAD Login, bother us, pick our brains, or just come up and ask questions right now. Thanks.
Do you have a resource for that wiki that you mentioned?
It is in the bit.ly link. I just have a GitHub README with all the links to it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I know you did say all AD functionality, but I feel like I have to test this because I've run this before. The add printer dialog for published printers in AD. Does it make those show up?
If when you add your printer, you have the negotiate key set to yes, I forget what the actual preference is. Basically, it's saying use LDAP authentication to authenticate to this printer. And if you have that set, then that dialog won't pop up because you have your Kerberos ticket. And as long as Kerberos authentication is enabled on your print server, it'll just go through.
OK, great.
And we can, if you want to talk about it more later, we can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would you recommend moving to NoMAD Login, but keeping the computer bound while converting the mobile account to a local account as like an easy rollout of NoMAD Login without actually having to do a lot of work on the...
Yeah, you can do that. That's not a problem. For a long time, we kept our Macs bound just for wireless authentication with machine certificates. So it's not like we went unbound right away.
Okay.
We still had a use for it. It's just that you want to make sure that when you're authenticating locally. You don't want to accidentally authenticate to like the mobile AD version of that account afterwards. But yeah, you could definitely kind of take small steps towards being completely unbound.
Sure. All right.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I feel like it's the wrong place to ask this, but in the end, where they had the integrating with NoMAD, I don't suppose there's any sort of integration you can do with Enterprise Connect as well, is there?
No. Nope. Enterprise Connect is a good product. It works. But at this point, NoMAD has kind of eclipsed it in functionality and feature set. And so depending on what your organizational requirements are, I mean, I pretty much say go with NoMAD no matter what. Yeah, leave it at that.
That's a great part. NoMAD, no matter what.
Okay, so one question I have is, assuming an 802.1x authentication to machines, describe for me maybe a workflow, how I get that set up, assuming my Wi-Fi is 802.1x. Would I stay on a name and password network to get through Setup Assistant and then have the profiles come down and switch to that, or?
That's pretty much it, yeah, is that you need to have some sort of open or less secure network or gated network
Just, yeah.
to get that routes back to AD or
Yeah.
whatever you need to get on 802.1x. And then once you're on that network, you can authenticate from there.
Okay, so
Yeah.
we get on a, okay.
Yeah,
Okay,
right now we just go wired until NoMAD login,
Yeah.
and then unwire it and deliver it to whoever we need to.
Okay.
Do you use this method on elementary and middle school labs as well?
We do not have a lot of lab setups. That's a good question. Another caveat to a lot of this is that it really works the best, in my opinion, in a one-to-one setup where there's really one user on that machine. You can do it with shared too. I mean, I'm not saying you can't, but it gets a little bit tricky. You just have to kind of adjust your workflow for it, because at that point you'll have multiple users log in, and then you'll have a lot of local accounts created. It's not that different from having a lot of old mobile accounts created in your lab setups. And maybe, I don't know, if anybody else has a lab setup that's using NoMAD Login, they can talk to a little bit more later. We don't actually have any Macs at K through 8. We only do one-to-one 9 through 12 with Macs.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So we tried NoMAD Login in labs, and it was terrible. It's amazing for one-to-one, but for that reason.
Okay.
So we haven't unbound yet, but we're looking to move to that. So I have some kind of beginner questions probably.
Sure.
Normally with a binding, we have like the group set up in the binding that says who's an admin on the machine.
Mm-hmm.
What's the best way to control like who gets admin, who doesn't need admin, how to like add, remove them?
There's a preference built into NoMAD Login that if they are part of a certain security group, they'll get admin rights on login.
Okay, so you still get all group memberships and everything like that?
Yeah, and NoMAD does the same thing, that if you log into NoMAD, you get the user's group memberships just in the preference file for NoMAD, and so you can parse those out and use those to do whatever you want.
Cool. And if you had to unlock an account, since it's local, is there a way to easily do that remotely?
That's a really good question. So, yeah, so if you were still a mobile account with AD authentication, you could change it off device, then log in again. This is a scenario where if you have a local account and you forget your password, you got to cut the lock. You know, if you lose the key to your lock, you cut it, right? Same thing. Hopefully you have a hidden or management or whatever account you use besides that one local account. Log into that, reset the password, then they can log in again. They'll have to create a new keychain because they don't know what their password is. But that's happened a few times now, and it has come up. But I think it happens a lot less than the other issues that could occur if you were bound.
Thank you.
So that gentleman actually just stole my question, but I will say that I do actually run NoMAD Login on labs, and I have a pretty successful run with that, so it does work.
In the post-install script, you're setting some, doing some settings to p-lists.
Mm-hmm.
Could that be handled with a config profile?
Yeah, and actually now that await configuration exists, and well,
Yeah.
it will exist in 10.9, that's probably the better way to go about it. This method is what we're using in production today, but it really was a workaround solution for Jamf not having that very basic support for MDM.
Thanks.
As you were talking about with the custom GUI at the login screen on the first boot, if someone's planning on keeping that down the road, does that still take an effect on encrypted machines as well?
I believe the answer is yes, but we do not large-scale use file vault encryption, so it might be a better question for somebody else. It does stay? Okay.
Just to let you know, the file vault login screen itself, the EFI unlock, that's completely out of everyone's touch. So that will look like it always looks. We can do a pass-through authentication all the way through, just like Apple does, but if you want it to stop at the login window, we also respect Apple's built-in MDM command setting to not do the login pass-through.
So our environment has all of our file shares set up through DFS, which is one of the key things that is holding us back from unbinding. Do you guys see any pathway for us to get out of that?
I think DFS is a hard solution
Yeah.
to solve for, or a hard problem to solve for. We do not use it, and we're trying to get away from traditional file shares as quickly as we possibly can.
Run away, please.
Yeah. But I don't know, Joel, you have any more updates on that?
So the particular issue with that is resolving the DFS share back to the discrete SMB link. And somebody, I don't know if he's here, has contributed some code that actually does an LDAP lookup to do that. We just need to spend a little more time with it to get it in. We've been a little busy lately. Yeah, I think we can solve it, but then I'm hoping everyone goes to OneDrive or Dropbox or Google Drive or something else before then.
They're investing millions in the solution.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not your fault. Yeah. Judgment-free zone. So yeah. So yeah, we've got some ideas around there. We just haven't gotten to have the time.
Okay, cool.
You specifically mentioned this authenticating to Active Directory and needing a path to AD. I just wanted to confirm that it's still passing information back to the Jamf server so that you can still do scoping based off of, or like all the user information is still being passed to Jamf as well, correct?
Yeah, so when it does its first recon, it'll pick up the local account information like it would normally. Okay. And to enroll during DEP, you would need a path back to your Jamf server as well. So if you've gotten that far, then you're probably good.
All right.
Yeah.
One of the things that we currently use with binding is Josh Miller's macOS Lapse tool. Is there the ability to write back to a computer attribute with this?
Not right now that I know of. That's interesting because we'd like to go to a similar solution. Yeah. Just get rid of the monolithic admin password. Yeah. So yeah, let's talk about it later.
Okay, because I know there's ones where you can write it as an EA within Jamf, but we'd rather not have that plain text. It's nice to put it in that central authority.
Some sort of hash and maybe the directories like, yeah, okay.
So, cool.
Yeah. Anyone else have questions? No? All right. Again, thanks for coming out. I really appreciate you all being here.